On the coldest night of the worst day of my life, the day the foundry let me go, and I had exactly one warm meal left to my name, I gave half of it to a starving stranger shivering on a bench in the merchant quarter. I had nothing. I mean that the way a man means it when he has counted his coins twice, and the number does not change. I had been turned out of work that very morning. I had a small son waiting for me in a cold room across the river, and the food cupped in my hands was the last food I could afford to put in front of him until I found some way to claw back the life that had just been taken from me. And I sat down beside a freezing woman that the entire glittering street had walked past all day long, and I split my last meal with her, because she looked hungrier than I felt, and because I could not do otherwise and still call myself the man my late wife had loved. What I did not know, what I would not learn until the snows had nearly melted, was that the ragged, gaunt, green-skinned woman huddled on that bench was one of the richest and most powerful figures in the entire realm, and that I, a worn-out human laborer with a box of my own tools under my arm, was the only soul in a city of 100,000 who had stopped for her. Not the silk-clad nobles who swept past with their noses in pomanders. Not the fat guildmasters with their bellies full and their purses fuller. The one man who stopped for that freezing orc woman was the one man on all of that street who had, that very morning, lost nearly everything he owned. I have turned that over 1,000 times since, and I still cannot decide whether it is the saddest part of this story or the most beautiful. Perhaps both at once. I am going to tell you the entire thing. Who that woman really was, why one of the wealthiest people in the realm was sitting on a public bench dressed as a beggar, and what came of it when she learned that the only soul who had shared with her was a human who had just been ground down to nothing himself. But more than any of that, this is a story about a thing I have come to believe is one of the truest in the world. That the ones who have the least are almost always the ones who give the most. Before I go on, let me say one quick thing, and then I will let the tale run free, because I am not a man who is easy with asking for anything. You will understand exactly why before the night is out. So I will not make a great speech of it. I will only say that if you have ever been scraped down to your very last and found out what you are made of, or if you have ever been knocked sideways by kindness from someone who had no earthly reason to give it, then this story was made for you. Stay with me to the end. And if this tale earns its keep along the way, there is a small bell down below you can ring to follow along, so the next story finds its way to you too. That is all. I will not mention it again. Now let me take you back to the coldest, and as it turned out the warmest, night of my life. My name is Caedmon Vale. I am 39 years old, a human, born in the low quarter and raised on thin broth and hard lessons. At the time all this happened, I worked the floor of the great river foundry, hauling iron and pouring molds. It was steady work, nothing a bard would sing of, but it kept a roof of sorts over our heads and coal of sorts in our little stove. And I am raising my boy on my own. My son is named Pim. He is 6 years old, and he is the whole of my world and very nearly the only reason I had for drawing breath. His mother, my wife Elspeth, passed 2 winters ago when the lung fever came through the low quarter and took the young and the kind, and left the rest of us standing in the cold wondering why. And from the day I lost her, my entire life narrowed to a single bright purpose. Take care of Pim. Keep him fed. Keep him warm. Keep him from ever feeling too sharply the cold, empty place where his mother used to be. That is the whole of it. Everything I do for that boy. And on the morning this story begins, I lost the means to do it. The foundry master called a dozen of us into the yard and told us the great trading houses had cut their orders, that the furnaces would run cold for a season, that there was no more work and no more wages, and he was sorry, and here was our final pay, and the gate was that way. No warning, just a handshake that would not quite meet my eye and a thin stack of coin that was already spoken for 3 times over before it touched my palm. I stood there in the freezing yard, holding a wooden box with my own hammer and tongs in it, and a small carved horse Pim had given me. And I felt the very floor of my life drop clean away beneath my boots. Because here is the thing about living the way we lived. Wage to wage. One man and his small son with no cushion under us, no savings buried in a jar, no family near enough to catch us if we fell. There is no margin in a life like that for a morning like that one. I did the reckoning right there in the yard with my breath smoking in the cold. And the reckoning was a terror. I had almost nothing put by. The rent on our room was due with the turn of the moon. And I had, in my actual pocket, a small, sad handful of coins that had to feed my son and me for however long it took me to find some new way to earn. And in a city where a season of cold furnaces meant 100 other men out hunting the same scraps of work, that could be a very long time indeed. I want to make you feel what that foundry yard felt like, because if you have never stood in a place like it, I am not certain I have the words. And if you have, then you already know. It is not a loud thing. Nobody shouts. They hand you a box and a few coins, and a man you have sweated beside for years cannot quite look at your face. And then you are simply standing in the gray morning with everything you own from that place held in two hands, and the world goes on exactly as it did the moment before. Carts rattling, gulls crying over the river, and meanwhile your entire life has quietly caved in on itself like a mine shaft. And the thing nobody warns you of is the shame. It floods up through you like cold water, even when it is not your doing, even when they cut a dozen men at once and it had nothing to do with you. Some old animal part of a man whispers that he has failed, that he could not protect his own child, that he is not enough, and never was. I stood in that yard thinking of Pim's small trusting face, and of Elsbeth, and of the promise I had made her at the very end with her hand going cold in mine, that I would keep our boy safe and fed and loved no matter what came. And I felt, standing there on a gray cold morning with iron dust in my throat, like I was breaking that promise to a dead woman before the morning was even half done. That is the man I was that day. Not merely out of work. Ashamed, afraid, and carrying a vow to a woman in the ground that I suddenly had no idea how to keep. So I did not go straight home. I could not yet face climbing those stairs and looking at my son and finding the words. I walked the long way, the river way, through the grand parts of the city I had no business walking through, because a man whose life has just ended somehow cannot bear to walk a straight line. And on that long cold walk, I did a foolish thing. I stopped at a little cookshop near the merchant quarter, the kind with a warm window and good smells leaking out under the door, and I spent a fair piece of those last coins on a hot meal. A good one. More than a sensible man would have spent. And I want to tell you why, because it matters to everything that came after. I bought a proper hot supper, roasted fowl and soft bread, and a little crock of buttered roots, still steaming, because that night I was going to have to sit my 6-year-old down by our cold little stove and find some gentle way to tell him that everything was about to get hard. And I could not bear, I simply could not bear, the thought of breaking that news to him over a bowl of thin gray porridge. I wanted us to have one good warm meal together first. One ordinary, happy supper, the kind we used to have, before the lean time came down on us. It was, by any reckoning of coin, a foolish way to spend nearly the last of what I had. But I think any parent who has ever loved a child through a hard season understands it in their bones. I wanted to give my boy one more good night before the worry crept in under the door. You have to understand my Pim to understand why I would spend my last coin on a hot supper instead of stretching it into 3 days of cheap grain, which is exactly what the cold, sensible part of me knew I ought to do. Pim is 6. He lost his mother when he was 4. And he is the bravest, gentlest little soul, with his mother's pale eyes and her way of going quiet when he is sad. And he has already had more taken from him than any child his age should ever bear. When Elsbeth died, I watched the light go dim in that boy for a long, frightening while. He stopped asking for stories. He stopped chasing the cats in the yard. And I spent 2 slow winters carefully coaxing that light back on, building him a small, warm world that felt safe and steady, where Da always had it handled, where there was always a supper and always a bedtime tale and always, somehow, enough. And now I was about to have to crack that little world open with my own 2 hands. I was going to have to sit him down and find words to tell a 6-year-old that things were going to be thin for a while, without making him afraid, without making him feel the ground shift the way I had felt it shift in that foundry yard. And I could not. I just could not do that to him over a bowl of gray porridge. So I spent the coin. And I would spend it again, every single time, in every life I might ever live, because that boy's sense of safety was the one thing I had left to give him. And by every god there is. I was going to give it to him one more night, no matter what it cost me. And then my long, foolish river walk took me through the little garden park that sits between the merchant quarter and the bridge to the low quarter. A patch of bare trees and frost-stiff grass with a few benches along a gravel path. And there, on a bench, in the bitter cold, was a woman. She was, by every appearance my eyes could gather, a beggar. She was wrapped in layers of ragged, mismatched cloth piled up against the cold, a worn satchel slumped against her hip, and her skin, for she was an orc, was a dull, sickly shade, the rich green of her kind gone gray and ashen at the edges the way green things go when they have been too long without warmth or food. Her tusks, the small lower ones that mark her people, were chipped and yellowed. Her dark hair hung lank and unwashed across a gaunt face. She was hunched down into herself, and she was shivering, really shivering, the deep, full-body shudder that comes not from a moment's chill, but from being cold for hour upon hour upon hour. And she had that hollow, scraped-out look about the eyes that I have learned means a person has not eaten in a long and frightening while. She was not begging. She was not calling out to anyone or holding up a cup. She was just sitting there, enduring, the way you see the truly forgotten endure. When the whole bright world has stopped seeing them and they have stopped expecting to be seen. And here is the thing I noticed. The thing I have turned over 10,000 times in the seasons since. The park was not empty. Not at all. People were walking through it, a good many of them, and a great many of them were folk who were doing very well for themselves indeed. Fine fur-lined cloaks, soft leather boots that had never known a day's labor, servants trailing behind with armfuls of wrapped purchases from the grand shops of the merchant quarter. Humans and orcs and dwarves and folk of every kind, but all of them well-fed and warm and prosperous. And every single one of them walked past that freezing, starving orc woman as though she were a stone in the path. Not one slowed his step. Not one turned her head. She was invisible to them, a whole flowing river of comfortable people, parting smoothly around her bench, the way a stream parts around a rock it has long since stopped noticing. And not one of them stopped. I stood at the edge of the gravel path and watched it happen for the length of perhaps a minute, and it did something to me that I am still not certain I can fully explain. There were folk crossing that park who could have fed that woman for a season and never felt the lack of it. Folk carrying single small parcels from the silk merchants that had cost more coin than I earned in a month of pouring iron. And every one of them had perfected the same small trick, the one we are all so good at, the little sliding of the eyes, where you see a person in need and your gaze somehow finds the rooftops or the middle distance, anywhere at all but the suffering face right in front of you, so that you never quite have to admit to yourself that they are there. I have done it myself, in better days. I will not pretend I am some saint who has never looked away. It is not that people are wicked, it is that it is so terribly easy, when you are warm and full and your own troubles are small, to make a suffering stranger simply vanish by the act of not looking. And the warmer and fuller you are, the easier it becomes. because their cold, hard world and your soft, warm world stop touching at any single point. I have come to think that is the real poverty at the top of things. Not a lack of coin, but a lack of the thing inside a person that makes them stop. Those fine folk flowing past that bench had everything in the world except the one small thing that would have made them slow their steps, and the worst of it is, they did not even know it was missing. And I stopped. I want to be honest with you about why. Because it was not because I am a good man. It was very nearly the opposite. It was because that very morning I had been handed a hard, fresh lesson in exactly how fast a person can fall. At dawn I had been a man with a trade and a wage and a place in the world. By mid-morning I was a man with a box of tools and a death clock ticking over my entire life. And I looked at that freezing orc woman on her bench, and instead of seeing someone safely on the far side of some line, someone to step neatly around, I saw someone who was perhaps only a few bad turns of fortune further down the very same road I had just that morning started walking. That could be me. A year from now, if every wrong thing goes wrong. That could be Pim's father, gray and hollow on a bench, with no one stopping. And I could not. I physically could not make my feet carry me past someone that cold and hungry while I stood there with a hot supper steaming in my own 2 hands, even if it was the last hot supper I owned in all the world. And I will tell you the other thing that was working on me. The thing I did not speak aloud to a living soul for a long while. It was Elspeth, my wife, near the end, when the fever had her and she was frightened in the nights. What she feared most was not the dying. It was the being forgotten. The being a burden. The being looked through as though she had already gone, while she was still right there and still herself behind her tired eyes. She used to whisper that the cruelest thing about being sick was the way some people stopped seeing you as a person at all. And here, on a frozen bench, was a woman cold and starving and looked straight through by the whole shining world. And something in me that still belonged to Elspeth and always will simply would not allow me to add one more pair of sliding eyes to the long, cruel procession that had walked past her all day. I knew, in my own body, in my own grief, exactly what it costs a living soul to be made invisible. I had watched it very nearly break the woman I loved before the fever ever did. So no, I could not walk past, not that day, not holding a hot meal, not as the man Elspeth had chosen and trusted and loved. Some part of me was keeping faith with my dead wife by stopping at that bench, though I could not have put it into those words at the time. I only knew that my feet stopped, and I turned, and I sat down. So I sat down beside her on that cold, hard bench, and she looked over at me, wary, her dark eyes narrowing. The careful, guarded look that comes over a person who is long used to being either ignored or troubled, and almost never simply met. I did not make any great show of it. I did not announce myself or my intentions. I just unwrapped that hot supper I had bought for my boy and me, the roasted fowl and the soft bread and the buttered roots, and I tore it cleanly into 2 halves right there on my knee, and I held one half out to her across the space between us, and I said something simple. I said, "It's a hard cold out tonight. You ought to eat something while it's warm. Go on. It's good. It's still hot." And she stared at me. For a long, strange moment she simply stared, her gaunt green face going through something I did not understand at the time, as though she could not make the picture in front of her resolve into any shape the world had ever shown her before. And then she reached out and took it, with hands that were genuinely shaking. And not only from the cold, I think now, though I did not know that then. And she ate. And I ate the other half right there beside her. And the 2 of us sat together on that frozen bench in the failing light and ate our supper in the cold, 2 strangers, a worn human laborer and a ragged orc woman, while the river of fine folk flowed past us both and saw neither of us at all. And I did not ask her a single question, and I did not preach at her, or pity her aloud, or ask how she had come to be there. I just sat with her, so that she would not have to eat alone. Because I have learned a hard thing in my life, and it is this, that sometimes the very hungriest part of a person is not the belly at all. It is the being alone with the hunger. That is a thing grief teaches you, if nothing else in this world ever does. After Elsbeth died, the hardest part of so many of my days was not the great black wave of the sadness. It was the small, quiet loneliness of eating my supper across the table from an empty chair, of having no one in the world to hand half my bread to, of the silence where her voice used to be. So I have never since been able to look at a person eating entirely alone, the truly alone, the lonely on the inside kind, without something in me wanting to go and sit down across from them. It costs you nothing. Sitting with someone. You do not have to mend their broken life, or solve their troubles, or even say much at all. You only have to be a second living soul in the space beside them, so that the food does not go down in silence. So that for a little while the world holds two people instead of one and none. I think, looking back, that half of what I truly gave that orc woman on the bench was never the meal at all. The meal was the smaller half of the gift. The larger half was the sitting down. It was the simple wordless thing the sitting said, which was, "You are not invisible to me. I see you. You are a person, and you and I are going to sit here together in the cold and eat like two people, because that is what we both are." And as we ate, we talked a little, low and easy. And there was something about her, even then, even ragged and freezing and gray as she was, something in the way she spoke, a precision to her words, a sharpness underneath, an old habit of command that did not sit quite right on a beggar's tongue. The way she shaped her sentences belonged to someone used to being listened to. But I did not think much of it at the time. Folk wash up on cold benches from every kind of life there is, and a person's past is their own to keep. And at one point she turned and looked very directly at my face, those dark eyes suddenly keen and searching, and she asked me why I had stopped when no one else in the entire city had, all the long day, and whether I was a man with a great deal to spare. And I laughed. I remember it was a tired, rueful sort of laugh, and I told her the plain truth. I said, "Spare? No, I'm afraid not. The truth of it is, I lost my place at the foundry this very morning. This supper here was near the last of my coin. I've a little boy waiting for me across the river, and I've got to find some way to keep him fed, and I haven't the first idea how yet." And she went very still. And she looked at me, really looked at me, the way few people in this life ever really look at another, as though she were reading something written deep under my skin. And she said, very quietly, "Then why in all the world would you give the half of it to me?" And I told her the thing I believe with all of my heart, the thing my own mother taught me, over a great many thin suppers, in a cold room much like the one my son was waiting in across the river. I said, "Because you needed it more than I did, just now. And because it's exactly when you've got next to nothing that you find out whether you're truly going to share or not. Anybody at all can give when their belly's full and their purse is heavy. That's no test of a soul. My mother always used to say it's the folk with the empty pockets who keep this whole cold world from freezing solid." So, I shrugged, there in the dark. I had a hot meal, and you were cold, and that was that. She did not say anything to that. But I saw her dark eyes fill and shine in the last of the light, and I figured it was only the kindness of it, the simple shock of being treated like a person after a hard, cold day, and I thought nothing more of it. I had no notion at all that I had just said something that was going to take that woman entirely apart, board by board, down to her very foundations. Looking back now, I understand exactly why those plain words landed on her the way they did, though I had no way of knowing it on the bench. Here was a woman who had spent that entire day gathering up evidence, piece by bitter piece, that people are selfish to the bone, that no one truly gives, that the world is cold the whole way down. And she had come close to believing it for good. And then a man who had lost his living that very morning handed her half of his last meal and told her, as though it were the plainest truth in all the world, that it is the folk with empty pockets who keep the whole world from freezing over. I was not trying to teach her a single thing. I was only saying what I had always believed. But to a soul on the very edge of giving up on her own kind, sitting cold and starving and invisible, it must have been like hearing the one true argument against everything that whole black day had been screaming at her, delivered by the one person in all the city with the standing to make it. A man with nothing, giving anyway, and asking not one thing back. No wonder her eyes filled. I had, without the faintest idea I was doing it, answered the exact question her strange day had been asking. We finished the food. And then I did one more thing, and I want to tell you about it plainly, because I am not telling this tale to make myself out a hero, only to tell it true. When we had eaten, I dug into my pocket and I took out the last small handful of coins I had in the world. It was not much, only a few thin coins, the last dregs of my final foundry pay. And I pressed them into her cold, shaking green hand and folded her fingers over them, and I told her to get herself something warm, a hot drink, a bed under a roof for the night if she could find one. And then I told her I had to get home to my boy. And I stood up off that bench, and I told her to take good care of herself, and to please try to get somewhere warm before the deep cold came down. And she looked up at me from the bench with those shining dark eyes, and she said, "What is your name?" And I told her. I said, Kedmon Vale. And she said, low and strange, "Thank you, Kedmon Vale. You have no idea what you have done this night." And I figured she meant only the meal and the coins. I gave her a tired smile, and I said it was nothing, truly, and I meant it. And I turned and walked home across the river through the cold dark to go and break my own heart, telling my son the bad news. And that, I thought, was the end of it. A small kindness on a black day. The kind that vanishes the very second it is over. The kind no one ever hears of again. I went home. I made the best night of it that I could with Pim, the two of us by the little stove with our half-suppers, and I told him a story and put him to bed and lay awake doing the terrible arithmetic. And in the cold gray days that followed I began the grim and grinding work of hunting for any work at all. And I honestly never expected to so much as think of that orc woman on the bench again. Now let me tell you who she really was. Her name was Vashtka Maug. I will leave the rest of her long line of titles off, for she never cared for them much herself. And she was, I would learn, a magnate, not merely wealthy, but one of the richest and most powerful figures in the entire realm. The head of the great Maug trading combine, whose ships crossed every sea and whose caravans crossed every road, whose warehouses ringed the harbor and whose coin moved through every market from the harbor cities to the mountain holds. A name that anyone who follows the doings of the mighty would have known in a single heartbeat. And she had not been a beggar at all. She had been in disguise. Here is the story of it, the one she told me later, when I had come to know her well enough to hear it. Vashtka Maug had spent all of her long life building her empire up out of nothing. She had been born, she told me, in a mud-floored croft in the Orc clanlands, the daughter of nobody. And she had clawed and bargained and out-thought her way up through every barrier the world had put in front of a clanless Orc woman, until she sat at the very top of the realm's commerce, with kings sending her their letters. But somewhere along that long, hard climb, up at the cold, thin summit of it, she had lost touch entirely with the actual living world. With ordinary folk. With what life is really like down on the ground for the tens of thousands who, in one way or another, worked her ships and her warehouses and her caravans, or whose small lives were shaped and shaken by the great decisions she made in her high tower. And she had been on the very brink of making one such decision. A vast one. Her combine was struggling against a hard season of losses, and her advisors were pressing her toward a great brutal cutting, closing warehouses, breaking contracts, turning out thousands upon thousands of dockhands and porters and clerks and carters across a dozen cities. The kind of decision made cleanly in a warm high room that lands like an axe on tens of thousands of lives far below. And something deep in her had rebelled against making that decision from inside the gilded bubble of her wealth. She had suffered a kind of crisis of the soul, a hollow ringing sense that she had built this vast and terrible engine and no longer had the faintest idea what it was truly like to be one of the small, ordinary people it might be about to crush. And so she had done a drastic and strange thing. She had dressed herself in the cast-off rags of the poorest beggar. She had left behind the silks and the jewels, the guards and the stewards, the seal rings and the carriages, and every last mark of who she was. And she had gone out, entirely alone and unknown, to spend one full day and night moving through the city as a penniless, invisible, homeless orc woman. Just to feel it. Just to see with her own eyes and in her own cold belly how the world truly treats you when you have nothing at all and no one to call upon. Just to learn, perhaps for the first time in her gilded life, what it is really like down where all her great clean decisions actually come to ground. And she told me it had been the most devastating day of her entire life, because she had spent all of it being treated as though she simply did not exist. She, a woman accustomed to every door swinging wide at her approach, to every face turning attentive, to the entire world quietly arranging itself around the gravity of her wealth. She spent one full day discovering what the world looks like to a soul that has nothing. And the answer, she said, was that the world looks straight through you as though you were a smear on a window it is trying to see past. All the long day, people had ignored her, avoided her, stepped wide around her, refused to so much as let their eyes touch hers. Hundreds upon hundreds of comfortable, prosperous, well-fed people, the very sort she had spent her whole life among, and not one of them, in a whole day, had treated her as a living person. She told me she had finally sat down on that bench in the Merchant Quarter Park, genuinely cold and genuinely starving by then, having eaten nothing since dawn, feeling more alone and more invisible than she had ever felt in all of her gilded and guarded life. And she had thought to herself, sitting there in the failing light, this is what I truly am to the world. Underneath all the money, nothing. This is how much one soul truly matters to another. When you strip away the coin, not at all. She told me of small particular moments that had cut her to the very bone, and the terrible thing about them was how ordinary they were. The kind of casual little cruelties aimed at the poor 1,000 times a day without a single comfortable soul even noticing. A warm tea house she had stepped into only to thaw her frozen hands, from which she had been turned out into the cold by a young server who told her sharply that beggars were not welcome. In a tone, she said, she had not once in her adult life been spoken to in. A well-dressed human mother who had pulled her small child sharply to the far side of the lane as Vashtka passed, her face curdling with distaste, as though this gray-skinned beggar woman were something filthy and dangerous. Hour upon hour of fine folks' eyes sliding off her like rain off oiled cloth, as though she were no more than a smudge on the glass of their pleasant day. She said the most frightening part of all was how swiftly it began to work upon her own mind, how, after only a few short hours of being treated as nothing, she had begun to feel like nothing. She had begun to hunch her shoulders inward. She had begun to drop her own gaze and avoid people's eyes before they could avoid hers, to spare herself the small, fresh sting of each fresh dismissal. To begin, in her own heart, to believe the verdict the whole bright world was handing down in the space of a single day. She said she finally understood, sitting frozen on that bench, a thing that had been completely invisible to her from the warm height of her tower, that being poor is not, at its root, about lacking coin. It is about being slowly and steadily erased, day after day, by 1,000 small hands that have each decided, without malice and without thought, that you simply do not count. And she had built a life. She realized this, sitting on that bench with the cold in her bones. She had built an entire empire that erased people exactly like that, by the tens of thousands, and she had never felt the weight of it. Never once. Until the day she put on the rags and felt it land on her own green skin. And she had been on the edge, she told me, of concluding something terrible and final. That people are cold and selfish all the way to the bottom. That kindness is a child's fairy tale. That everyone, underneath, is exactly as alone as she felt on that bench, and that all the warmth in the world is just a transaction wearing a friendly face. And then a man had sat down beside her. A man who, she would learn not 10 minutes later, had himself lost his living that very morning and was carrying the very last of his food in his hands. And that man had torn his last meal cleanly in half and handed it to her, and pressed his last few coins into her shaking hand, and sat with her in the cold so that she would not have to eat alone, and told her, as though it were the simplest truth in all the world, that it is the folk with empty pockets who keep the whole world from freezing over. She told me later that I broke her heart wide open on that bench, that after a full day of being looked clean through by the wealthy and the comfortable, the only person in the entire city who had stopped, who had truly seen her, who had shared with her, was a man who had nothing left in all the world to share. That the single act of kindness she had received in all of her bitter experiment had come from the one person in the city who could least afford to give it. She said she sat there on that bench long after I had walked away into the dark, and she wept. Wept harder, she told me, than she had wept in 20 hard years. Because in the very middle of proving to her own satisfaction that the world was cold and selfish to the core, a broke and grieving human father had reached across the space between them and proven, beyond any argument, the exact and shining opposite. And had no idea at all that he was doing it, and had wanted nothing whatsoever in return. Now, let me tell you what she did. Because this is where my life, and Pim's life, changed forever. For some weeks I heard nothing at all, and expected to hear nothing. I was deep in the hard, hungry middle of it by then, walking the docks and the workshops every cold dawn, begging for any day's labor I could get, stretching every thin coin until it screamed, lying awake half the night doing the same terrible arithmetic over and over the way a man does when the floor has dropped out from under his entire life and he cannot find the bottom. I had told Pim, gently, that I had left the foundry and was looking for new work, and that things would be a little thin for a while, and he had taken it the way that brave boy takes everything, with a small solemn nod and a yes-da that very nearly finished me where I stood. I had not told the woman on the bench another thought. She had become, in my memory, a small, sad mystery, a freezing soul I had worried over for a night and then released into the great cold dark of the city, never to know her fate. And then, on a gray morning in the late cold, a richly dressed steward came to the door of our little room across the river, looking deeply out of place on our broken stair, and told me that the House of Maug requested the presence of one Caedmon Vale at the Trading Combine's tower in the merchant quarter, at my earliest convenience. And I figured it was work. One of the dozens of desperate inquiries I had thrown out into the void had at last washed back to shore. Some great house needed strong backs to haul cargo, and my name had come up on some clerk's list. That was all I let myself believe, because a man in my place cannot afford to hope for more than the next day's bread without the hoping itself becoming a kind of danger. So I put on my one good shirt, the one I had been married in, and I scrubbed the iron from under my nails as best I could, and I walked across the river and into the grand merchant quarter and up to the foot of the great Maug Tower, a soaring thing of pale stone and glass that I had passed 1,000 times in my life and never once dreamed of entering. And I was shown up, and up, and up, through halls finer than anything I had ever stood in, by quiet servants who looked at my one good shirt and said nothing, until at last I was brought into a vast high chamber at the very top of the tower, with windows that looked out over all of the city and the harbor and the gray sea beyond. And behind a great desk of dark polished wood stood a sharply dressed, powerful orc woman, her green skin deep and rich and healthy, her dark hair bound back in a style that must have cost a craftsman a day's work, robed in deep-dyed cloth I could not have bought with a year of my old wages. A woman I was certain I had never in my life laid eyes upon. Except that I had, because when she rose from behind that great desk and turned the full of her face toward me, I knew those eyes. I knew them at once and beyond any doubt. It was her, the woman from the bench, the freezing, gray-skinned, ragged soul I had shared my last supper with, scrubbed and warmed and clad now in robes of state, standing in a chamber in the sky at the very summit of the realm's commerce. And I simply stood there in my one good shirt with my mouth open and my mind gone entirely white, wholly unable to make sense of what I was looking at. It is a strange and reeling thing to have two completely separate pictures of a single person slammed together into one in the space of a heartbeat. For weeks, the woman on the bench had lived in my memory as that fragile, freezing, forgotten soul I had worried over and figured I would never learn the fate of. And here she stood, the single most powerful person I had ever shared a room with, robed and crowned in her own quiet authority, with the entire city spread out small behind her through the glass. My mind genuinely could not hold the two of them at once. I kept hunting for the freezing beggar in the magnate's healthy green face, and finding her there in the dark, keen eyes, and then losing her again in the rich robes and the straight, proud shoulders. And the thing I felt, underneath all the shock, surprised me more than anything. It was not joy that a great and wealthy woman knew my name. It was something far closer to grief. Because I understood, standing there, that the cold and starving woman I had sat with on that bench, the one I had felt such sudden fierce tenderness for, had, in a sense, never existed at all. And yet she also entirely had. Because whatever the rags had been, a real and living soul had sat shivering on that bench in the dark. And a real and living soul had been moved to weeping by the gift of half a cold supper. The disguise had been false. But what had passed between the two of us on that bench had been as true as anything I have ever known. And that, I have come to think, is precisely why it worked upon us both so deeply. Stripped of every mark of who she and I had met each other as nothing more and nothing less than two living people in the cold. A thing her wealth and her power almost always made impossible for her, in the whole rest of her life. And Vashka Maug came around that great desk, and this towering, powerful woman took both of my rough, scarred hands in her own, and she told me everything. The disguise, the experiment, the long, devastating day of being made invisible, and what it had meant to her at the very lowest and coldest moment of all of it to have one single soul in the entire city stop and sit down and share. She told me she had spent no small effort and no small coin tracking me down, for she had had only a first name and a face and the knowledge that I lived somewhere across the river. Because she could not, she said, let what I had done that night go unanswered in the world. And then she offered me a place. Not a handout. She was fierce and careful about that distinction. Fiercer than I understood at first, because she had come to learn from that one cold day exactly how much a person's dignity is worth, and exactly how easily a gift can wound the soul it means to help. She offered me a true position. A good one. A real place in the House of Maug. Steady. Well paid. With security and protections and a roof I would never again have to fear losing. The kind of position that would let me raise my pim without ever again lying awake in the dark doing that terrible arithmetic. The kind of solid ground beneath my boots that I had lost forever in that foundry yard and had been so terribly certain I would never find again. She looked me hard in the eye, still holding my hands, and she said, "Hear me well, Kedmon Vale. I am not offering you this because I pity you. Pity is a poison, and I would not insult you with it. I am offering it to you because on the worst morning of your life, with nothing at all left to your name, you showed me the exact kind of character that I have spent 20 years and a vast fortune searching for and almost never finding among people who have everything in the world. I have watched men with every advantage under the sun reveal themselves, when tested, to be small and grasping and afraid. And I watched a man with nothing at all reveal himself, when tested, to be the precise and shining opposite. I would be a fool of a businesswoman, and I did not climb out of a mudcroft by being a fool. To hand that kind of character a coin and send it on its way, when I could instead give it a place at my side. Come and work for me. Earn your boy's future with your own 2 hands. It is the only way either of us would ever want it done. I took the place. Of course I took the place. And it gave my son and me our whole lives back, solid ground, a future. The simple blessed ability to be the father I needed to be without the constant gnawing terror of the next moon's rent. She gave me back, in that high chamber, the one single thing I had lost in that foundry yard, which was the power to keep my promise to a dead woman and take proper care of our boy. I never did have to give Pim the hard, frightening talk in the way I had so dreaded. Oh, I told him plainly that I had found new and better work, and that for a little while things had been tight, because I do not ever lie to that boy. But I got to tell it as a story that had already turned out all right, told from solid ground with a full belly and a warm stove, which is a different thing entirely from telling a frightened child that the floor is falling while you are both still tumbling through the dark. And on the day of my first proper pay from the house of Maug, I did a thing I will carry with me to my grave. I took Pim back to that same little cook shop, and I bought us the same hot supper I had bought on the day I lost everything. And I took him to that same little park, and we sat and ate it on a bench. Maybe even the very same one. I like to believe that it was. And I told him, in the plain, simple way you tell a 6-year-old a true and important thing, that once, on this very bench, when we had almost nothing left in the world, his da had shared his supper with a cold and hungry stranger, and that it had turned out to be the best thing his da had ever done. I wanted that lesson down in the boy's bones early, before the hard world could teach him to hold tight and look away. I wanted my son to know, deep down where it counts, that you give especially when it is hard, and that you never, ever truly know who it is you are sitting down beside. Now, I could end the tale there, and it would be a fine enough tale. A man does a kindness at his lowest, and the kindness comes back to him 100-fold, and his life is saved. But that is not the whole of the story, and it is not even the best of it. Because what came after, what grew slow and unlikely in the seasons that followed in the high halls of the house of Maug, is the part of this tale I have told to almost no one. And it is the part the whole rest of it was secretly about all along. I went to work for her. And I want you to understand what that was like, because nothing in my life had prepared me for it. I was a foundry hand. I knew iron and sweat and the weight of things. And here I was, set to work in the great combine, learning the moving of cargo and the keeping of warehouses and the reckoning of shipments, surrounded by clerks schooled in fine academies and stewards who had served great houses all their lives. I did not belong, and I knew it, and for a long while I worked twice as hard as any man there, simply to prove that her faith in me had not been misplaced. And in those early weeks, I saw her only rarely and always at a great distance, a robed figure far up at the top of the tower, a name that moved 1,000 lives with a word, the head of the entire vast enterprise that now, somehow, fed my son. But she did not let it stay at a distance. That was the first thing I learned about Vashdka Maug that I had not learned on the bench. She had decided that I was to be no ordinary clerk kept at arm's length. She began to call me up to her high chamber, at first to ask my counsel on small things, the actual workings of the docks and warehouses, the true daily lives of the men who labored in them, the things she had spent a full devastating day discovering she knew nothing about. She wanted, she told me bluntly to keep one honest human voice near her that had stood on the cold ground and would tell her the truth of how things landed down there, rather than the smooth, pleasant lies her high advisors told her. And so, slowly, over many such summonings, the great distance between the magnate and the foundry hand began, against all sense and all the ordering of the world, to close. I would come up into that chamber in the sky, cap in my scarred hands, and she would wave me to a chair as though I were a peer and not a porter, and she would ask me hard questions and listen to my plain answers with a fierce attention I had never once been given by anyone of her station. And somewhere in among the talk of cargo and contracts, we began, little by little, to simply talk about my Pym and the small, fierce light of him, about her own long, hard climb up out of the mud, which she had told to almost no one, about iron and ships and the strange shapes a life can take. And I began to see her, not the magnate, not the legend, but the woman, sharp as a blade and twice as quick, lonely in a way that all that wealth had only deepened, walled away at the top of her tower with no soul around her who was not paid to be there, carrying her own old griefs that she let no one see. For she was a widow too. I learned that slowly, in pieces, the way you learn the deep things about a guarded person. Her husband had died many years before, in the hard early days when they had been building the combine up out of nothing together, side by side. And after he was gone, she had poured all of herself into the work, year upon year, raising up an empire in the shape of the grief she would not look at directly, until she stood alone at the top of the greatest trading house in the realm, with no soul left who had known her when she was young and clanless and unafraid. She told me once, late in a long evening of talk, that the day on the bench had not only shown her the cruelty of the comfortable, it had shown her, with a terrible clarity, exactly how alone she had let herself become. That she had sat freezing among hundreds of people and understood that not one of them would have wept to see her gone, and that this was not the world's doing, but her own, the slow harvest of a life given wholly to the work and to no living soul. And I understood that. By every god, I understood it down to the ground. Because I had done a smaller version of the same thing after Elsbeth died, pouring myself wholly into Pym and into the foundry and into the grinding business of getting through the days, walling away my own grief behind so much hard labor that I had not let another grown soul truly near me in 2 long winters. We were, the two of us, the magnet and the foundry hand, far more alike under the skin than either of our worlds would ever have guessed. 2 widowed people who had each buried half of themselves in their work to keep from looking at the cold, empty chair. And I think we both began to see it in the other long before either of us dared to say a single word of it aloud. Because there was so much in the way. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a lie to tell you it was simple. She was the richest orc in the realm, and I was a human laborer in a borrowed shirt. She moved among kings, and I had until lately moved among furnace slag. And more than the coin, there was the plain hard fact that she was my employer, that she had given my son his entire future, and that anything growing between us would always sit in the long shadow of that debt. How could a man ever know? How could she ever know? Whether what either of us felt was true or only the warped reflection of so much gratitude and so much power. I lay awake over it more than one night. I told myself I was a fool of a widower spinning castles out of a great lady's simple kindness. I told myself that orc and human, magnate and porter were not a thing the world made room for, and that I had a son to think of and no business risking the solid ground he stood on for the sake of an old lonely man's impossible hope. I told myself to keep my eyes down and my mouth shut, and to be only the honest clerk she had hired, and grateful for it. And I would have, I think. I would have kept it locked down inside me to the end of my days, out of fear and out of the long habit of looking away from my own heart, if she had not been braver than I was. It was a late evening, near the turn of the year, a full cycle of seasons since the night on the bench. I had been up in her chamber going over the great matter that had started it all, for she had never made the brutal cutting after all. And I will come to that. And the work was done, and the city lay dark and glittering below the glass, and we had fallen into one of our long, easy silences. The comfortable kind that only grows between two souls who have stopped needing to fill the quiet. And she was standing at the great window with her back to me, looking out at the lights, and she said, without turning round, in a low voice I had never quite heard her use before, "Do you know, Kedmon, that you are the only person in all of this realm who has ever shared anything with me expecting nothing back? In my whole long life. The only one. Everyone else who has ever given me a thing, and a great many have given me a great many things, has wanted something in return, whether they were honest enough to know it or not. Contracts, favor, coin, safety, a place in my shadow. Every gift I have ever been given came with an invisible price tagged to it. And I learned long ago to read the price before I read the gift." She paused, and I saw her hand press flat against the cold glass. And then a broke and grieving man on a bench, who had every reason to keep his last meal for his own child, tore it in half and gave it to a ragged stranger, and walked away into the dark without leaving me even a way to find him. Wanting nothing. Not even to be thanked. Truly. And I have spent a whole year now trying to understand it, and I think I have finally understood. It was the only gift I have ever in my life been given that was free. And I find that and hear her voice, that fierce, certain voice that moved 1,000 lives with a word, caught and faltered. I find that I cannot stop thinking about the man who gave it. And she turned from the window, and the most powerful woman in the realm looked at a foundry hand in a borrowed wedding shirt, with her dark eyes bright and afraid. This woman who feared nothing, and she did not say another word. She only waited. Having laid all of it down between us and left it there, undefended, the way I had laid down half a supper on a bench a year before, giving me the thing, and asking nothing, and leaving it entirely to me what I would do with it. And every fear I had nursed for a year, the coin, the debt, the long shadow of her power, the old widower's certainty that such things are not for the likes of me, every bit of it rose up at once in my throat. And then I looked at her standing there, brave and bare and waiting, having found the courage that I had not, and I understood that all my careful reasons had only ever been fear wearing the mask of good sense. I crossed that chamber, and I took both her hands in mine, the way she had taken mine in that high room a year before. And I told her the truth, because I have never been able to tell that woman anything else. I told her that I had loved her, I thought, since long before I had any right to, and had buried it deep out of fear of exactly all the things that stood between us. That I was a poor man, and she was the richest in the realm, and I did not care a single copper for any of it, except that I was afraid she could never be sure my heart was true, and not just bought by her kindness. And she laughed, that same tired, real laugh I had first heard on the bench when I told her I had nothing to spare, and she said that she was the one soul in all the realm perfectly equipped to know the difference between a heart that wanted her coin and a heart that wanted her, having spent her whole life learning to tell them apart, and that she had known the truth of mine since the night I gave away a meal I could not spare to a stranger I would never see again. "You gave to me, Kedmon Vale, when I was nothing and had nothing and could give you nothing back," she said. "There is no purer proof of a true heart anywhere. I have been certain of you far longer than you have been certain of yourself, and that, I will say it plainly, and let the grand folk make of it what they will, that was the beginning of the rest of both our lives. I will not lay our whole private happiness out here for the telling. Some things a man keeps, but I will say that the great house of Maug came, in time, to have a human master at its lady's side, and a small human boy growing up in its high halls with the run of the place, and a green-skinned stepmother who taught him to drive a hard bargain and to sit a horse, and to never once walk past a cold soul on a bench. Pym took to her from nearly the first, Children know a true thing faster than grown folk do, and to see that boy, who had lost so much so young, racing laughing down those grand halls with the most powerful woman in the realm chasing after him pretending to be a hill troll, healed a place in me I had thought would ache until I died. We were a strange family, by the reckoning of the world. An orc and a human, and a small motherless boy. But we were a family, true and whole, and we had each of us been so alone before, and I have never once cared what the world made of the shape of it. But here is the part that matters even more than my own saved life and my own unlooked-for love. The part I think about most of all. Because that one cold night on the bench did not only change my life and Vashtka's. Through her, it changed the lives of a great many thousands of souls who will never know my name nor hers, nor anything at all of how it came to pass. That experiment, that one devastating day of being made invisible, and the single act of kindness that broke through it, changed how Vashtka Maug saw the whole of her empire. She told me she had walked back into her own life after that day on the bench and looked at her great combine and its tens of thousands of laborers and the brutal cutting she had been about to order, and seen all of it completely differently than she ever had before. She had been on the very point of doing the cold clean thing that the high warm rooms always counsel. The closures, the broken contracts, the thousands turned out into the cold to save the ledgers. And instead she scrapped the brutal plan entirely and thought it all through again from the beginning. With a single question burning in the front of her mind that she said she had gotten from a broke man on a bench, what happens to the actual living souls? Down where all of this finally lands, she remade the policies of the entire house. She changed how the lowest paid and least regarded of her tens of thousands of workers were treated and paid and protected. She told me, plainly and to my face, that a broke human father sharing his last meal had done more to change the way she ran her empire than every advisor and clever steward she had ever paid in 20 years. She walked me through it once, and I will not pretend I followed every fine detail of the commerce. But the heart of it I understood completely. She had been about to do to many thousands of families exactly the thing that had been done to mine in that foundry yard. The box, the handshake that will not meet your eye, the floor dropping clean away. And she said that after that one day on the bench, she could not sign the order. Because she could no longer not see the foundry yards, the cold little rooms across the river, the small brave 6-year-olds who would be told that night that things were going to get hard. The comfortable abstraction was gone forever. Every cold number on every page had become, for her, a living person on a bench. So she found another way. Harder for the combine and its ledgers, far better for the living souls. She remade how the lowest of her workers were paid and treated, and she put in protections of a kind the great houses simply do not bother with. The sort of quiet safeguard that no bard ever sings of, but that keeps thousands of families off the cold bench and out of the foundry yard, year upon year. And here is the thing that catches in my throat every time I think on it. Not one of those thousands of souls will ever know my name, or know that any part of their small added measure of security traces back to half a cold supper shared on a bench on the worst night of one broke man's life. They will simply have a little more safety, a little more dignity, a little more ground beneath their feet, and never once know why. And that is very nearly the most beautiful part of the whole thing. A single kindness can travel that far from the cold spot where you first set it down, touch many thousands of lives you will never meet, in cities you will never see, and ask for absolutely nothing in return. Not even to be known of. I thought I was feeding one cold woman on a bench. I was, it turned out, doing a thing so much larger than that I still cannot fully fit my mind around it. So, a man with nothing, on the worst night of his life, sharing the half of a meal. And it reached, through the strangest of chains, into one of the most powerful souls in the entire realm, and changed how she treated tens of thousands of laborers she would never meet, and gave a lonely widow back her own buried heart, and gave a motherless boy a whole new family, and gave a broke foundry hand a life he could never in 100 years have dreamed of. I think on that a great deal. From the warm, safe high ground I now stand upon because of it. About how you never ever truly know what a single small act of kindness is going to touch, or how far it is going to travel, or whose entire life it is going to remake, your own most of all. I thought I was only sharing my supper with a cold stranger in the dark. I had not the faintest notion I was sitting beside a soul who could change 10,000 lives, and that my half a meal was going to be the thing that moved her to do it. And the wildest part of all of it, the part I cannot get over even now, is that none of it would ever have come to pass if I had done the sensible thing and kept my food. The long chain of it, my saved life, my found love, her changed heart, my son's new family, the tens of thousands of laborers treated better in a dozen cities, all of it, every link, hung entirely upon one broke and grieving man, on the worst morning of his life, deciding in a single moment not to walk past a freezing stranger on a bench. I have lived now on both sides of it, you understand. I have been poor, scraped down to my last coin with the floor falling away. And I have been comfortable, robed and warm, and wanting for nothing, walking the high halls of the greatest house in the realm. And I will tell you the truest thing I have learned from standing on both sides of that line, the thing I would carve over every door in this realm if I had the power. The folk who have the least are almost always the ones who give the most. It is not the comfortable and the well-fed who stop for the soul on the bench. It is the other broke person. It is the ones who know in their own cold bones exactly what it is to be hungry and frozen and invisible, who cannot bear to walk past another soul who is hungry and frozen and invisible. Real generosity, the kind that genuinely costs you something, that takes food out of your own mouth, lives most often in the empty pockets of the people who can least afford it. And I think I understand at last why that is so. When you have never once gone without, the soul on the bench is a stranger to you, a different kind of creature, easy to step around and easy to forget. But when you have been close to that bench yourself, when you know in your gut it could just as easily be you sitting there, then you cannot walk past. Their hunger is too real to you. It is your own hunger, only a few bad turns of fortune away. Empathy, I have come to believe, is mostly just memory. The people who give the most are the people who remember most clearly what it is to have nothing at all. And that means something hopeful, if you sit with it. It means kindness is not some luxury you finally earn once you have made it, a fine thing you will get around to once your own pockets are full. If it were, the rich would be the kindest folk alive, and you and I both know that is not how the world works. Kindness is a thing you can do right now, at your very lowest, with empty pockets and a closed gate behind you and the floor falling away beneath you. And in plain fact, your lowest may be the exact moment you are best equipped to do it, because at your lowest you can see the soul on the bench clearly, as a brother, as yourself, in a way the comfortable and the warm simply never can. So do not wait to be generous until it is easy. It may never once be easy, and the generosity that costs you nothing was never worth much to begin with. The half a meal I could barely spare that cold night was worth 1,000 times over the untouched meals those comfortable folk in the park could have given without a moment's thought, precisely and only because it cost me something. That is the strange backward arithmetic at the heart of it. A kindness is worth the most exactly when you can least afford to give it. Which means, if you turn it all the way around, that the poorest among us are walking through the world rich beyond measure in the one currency that has ever actually mattered. And most of them do not even know they are holding it. So here is the thing I want to leave with you. The next time you see somebody the whole bright world is walking straight past, the soul on the bench, the invisible one, the one everybody's well-shod feet are stepping smoothly around, do not wait until you have plenty to spare to be kind to them. Because that day of plenty may never come, and the kindness that costs you something is the only kind that has ever truly counted. Stop, sit down beside them, Share what you have, even if it is the very last of it. Even if it is the half of your own last supper on the worst night of your life. You will almost never regret it. And just once in a great while, you will find out that you were sitting beside someone. Or that you yourself were someone. Far greater and stranger and more important than you could ever in your wildest dreaming have guessed. And even on all the other times. Even when nothing whatsoever comes back to you, even when there is no high tower, and no changed heart, and no unlooked-for love, and no new family waiting at the far end of it. Even then you will have kept your own small corner of this cold world from freezing over for one more night. Which my own mother always told me, over a great many thin and happy suppers, is the whole entire job of being a person in this world. So tell me, down below where the talk happens, tell me of a time when someone who had very little shared something with you. Or a time you yourself gave when you barely had enough for your own. I read every single one of them, truly I do. And those stories, the kindness of folk who had no reason and no margin at all to be kind, and were kind anyway, are the ones that have stayed with me my entire life and shaped the whole of how I try to walk through this world. And listen, I am still not a man who is easy with asking. You know that about me now, after everything. But if this story meant something to you tonight, the bell to follow along is right down there, and I would be truly honored to have you back beside me for the next tale. Until then, here is the one single thing I most want you to carry out of all of this and into your own cold streets. Somewhere today, tomorrow, this very week, you are going to pass a soul that the whole world is stepping around. Do not wait until your own pockets are full to share what is in them. Your pockets may never once be full in this life, and the sharing that costs you something is the only kind that has ever, in the whole long history of the world, truly mattered. Stop, sit down. Split what you have. You never know who is on the bench. You never know who you yourself might turn out to be.